Yes, she's a Christ figure too, from How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas Foster. This may surprise some of you, but we live in a Christian culture. What I mean is that the preponderance of cultural influences has come to us down from European early settlers, and since those early settlers inflicted their values on the benighted cultures they encountered, benighted from the Old English meaning anyone darker than myself, those inflicted values have gained ascendancy. This is not to say that all citizens of this great republic are Christian any more than they are all great little r Republicans. I once heard a well known Jewish professor of composition speak about walking into her very first final examination in college only to be confronted with a question: discuss the Christian imagery in Billy Budd. It simply never occurred to her professor back in the 1950s that Christian imagery might be alien territory for some students. Institutions of higher learning can no longer blithely assume that everyone in class is a Christian, and if they do, it's at their own risk. Still, no matter what your religious beliefs, to get the most out of what you're reading of European and American literature, knowing something about the Old and New Testaments is essential. Similarly, if you undertake to read literature from an Islamic or Buddhist or Hindu culture, you're going to need knowledge of their other religious traditions. Culture is so infused by its dominant religious systems that whether a writer adheres to the beliefs or not, the values and the principles of those religions will inevitably inform the literary work. Often, those values will not be religious in nature, but may show themselves in connection with the individual's role within society, or humankind's relation to nature, or the involvement of women in public life, although, as we have just seen, just as often religion shows up in the form of illusions and analogs. When I read an Indian novel, for example, I'm often aware, if only dimly, of how much I'm missing due to my ignorance of the various religious traditions of the subcontinent. Since I'd like to get more out of my reading, I've worked to reduce that ignorance, but I still have a long way to go. Okay, so not everyone is a Christian around these parts, nor do those who would say that they necessarily are have more than a nodding familiarity with the New Testament, aside from John 3:16, which is always beside the goalposts of football games. But in all probability, they do know one thing. They know why it's called Christianity. Okay, so it's not the most profound insight ever, but it matters a lot. Northrop Frye, one of the great literary critics in the 1950s, said that biblical typology, the comparative study of types between the Old Testament and the New Testament, have by extension out in our literature, was a dead language, and things haven't improved since then. While we may not be all that well versed in the types and archetypes from the Bible, we generally recognize, whatever our religious affiliation, some of the features that make Christ who he is. Whether you do or do not, this list may be helpful. 1. Crucified, wounds in the hands, feet, side, and head. 2. In agony. 3. Self-sacrificing. 4. Good with children. 5. Good with loaves, fishes, water, wine. 6. 33 years of age when last seen. 7. Employed as a carpenter. 8. Known to use humble modes of transportation, feet or donkeys preferred. 9. Believed to have walked on water. 10. Often portrayed with arms outstretched. 11. Known to have spent time alone in the wilderness. 12. Believed to have had a confrontation with the devil, possibly tempted. 13. Last seen in the company of thieves. 14. Creator of many aphorisms and parables. 15. Buried, but arose on the third day. 16 had disciples, 12 at first, although not all equally devoted. 17, very forgiving. 18, came to redeem an unworthy world. You may not subscribe to this list. You may find it too glib. But if you want to read like a literature professor, you need to put aside your belief system, at least for the period of time during which you read, so that you can see what the writer is trying to say. As you're reading that story or that poem, religious knowledge is helpful, although religious belief is too tightly held, it can also be a problem. We want to be able to identify features in stories and see how they are being used. In other words, we want to be analytical. Say we're reading a book, a novel, short story, say. And let's say this short novel has a man in it, a man no longer young, in fact old, as well as very poor and engaged in a humble profession. Not carpentry, say, but fishing. Jesus had some dealings with fishermen too, and is often connected symbolically with fish, so that's a point of similarity. And the old fisherman hasn't had much good luck for a long time, so no one believes in him. In general, there's a lot of doubt and non-belief in our story. But one young boy believes in him. Sadly, though, the boy isn't allowed to accompany the fisherman anymore, because everyone, the boy's parents included, think the old man is bad luck. There's a second point of similarity. He's good with children, or at least one child. And he has one disciple. And this old man is very good and pure, so that's another point, because the world he lives in is rather sullied and unworthy, fallen even. During his solitary fishing trip, the old man hooks into a big fish that takes him far out beyond his known limits to where the sea becomes a wilderness. He's all alone, and he's put through great physical suffering, during which he even begins to doubt himself. His hands are ripped up by the struggle. He thinks he's broken something to his side, but he bucks himself up with aphorisms like, "A man is not made for defeat. A man can be destroyed, but not defeated." Inspiring things like that. Somehow he can endure this whole episode, which lasts 3 days, and which finally makes it seem to those on the land that he's dead. His great fish is ruined by sharks, and he manages to drag this huge ruined skeleton back to the port. His return is like a resurrection. He has to walk up a hill from the water to the shack, and he carries his mast, which looks like a man carrying a cross from a certain point of view. Then he lies on his bed, exhausted by his struggles, his arms thrown out in the position of crucifixion, showing his damaged raw hands. And the next morning, when people see the great fish, even the doubters begin to believe in him again. He brings a kind of hope, a kind of redemption to this fallen world. And yes, didn't Hemingway write a book like that? Yes, The Old Man of the Sea, 1952, a nearly perfect literary parable, so clear with symbols so available that the Christian imagery is accessible to even beginning readers. But let's give old Hemingway some credit here. The narrative is more subtle than I've just made it sound, and the struggle is so vivid and concrete that one can get a lot out of it. Triumph over adversity, the value of hope and faith, the attainment of grace without placing undue weight on the old man, Santiago, as a Christ figure. So must all Christ figures be as unambiguous as this? No, they don't have to have it to hit all the marks. Don't have to be male, don't have to be Christian, don't have to be good even. See the stories of Flannery O'Connor, for example, after there, however, we're starting to get into the irony, and that's a whole different area where I don't want to go just yet. But if a character is a certain age, exhibits certain behaviors, provides for certain outcomes, or suffers in certain ways, your literary antennas should begin to twitch. How should we know, though? Here's a handy list, not all-inclusive, but a start. You might be a Christ figure if you are 33 years old, or unmarried, preferably celibate, or wounded or marked in the hands, feet, or side, crown of thorns, extra credit, sacrificing yourself in some way for others, your life is best and your sacrifice doesn't have to be willing, in some sort of wilderness, tempted there, accosted by the devil. Oh, you get the point. Consult previous list. Are there things you don't have to do? Certainly. Consider Santiago again. Wait, you say, shouldn't he be 33? And the answer is, sometimes that's good, but a Christ figure doesn't have to resemble Christ in every way. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a Christ figure. He'd be, well, Christ. The literal elements, changing water into wine, unless in some clumsy way as pouring out someone's water and filling his glass with wine, stretching loaves and fishes to feed 5,000, preaching, although some do, suffering actual crucifixion, literally following in his footsteps, aren't really required. It's the symbolic level we're interested in. Which brings us to another issue we've touched upon in other chapters. Fiction and poetry and drama are not necessarily playgrounds for the overly literal. Many times, I'll point out that a character is Christ-like because he does X and Y. And you might come back with, but Christ did A and Z, and his X wasn't like that. And besides, his characters listen to AC/DC. This character listens to AC/DC. Okay, so the heavy metal sound isn't in the hymnal, and this character would be very hard-pressed to take over savior duty. No literary Christ figure can ever be as pure, as perfect, or as divine as Jesus Christ. Here, as elsewhere, one does well to remember that writing literature is an exercise in the imagination, and so is reading it. We have to bring our imaginations to bear on a story if we are to sell its possibilities. Otherwise, it's just about somebody who did something. Whatever we take away from the stories in the way of significance, symbolism, theme, meaning, pretty much anything except character and plot, we discover because our imagination engages with that of the author. Pretty amazing when you consider that the author may have been dead for 1,000 years, yet we can still have this kind of exchange, this dialogue with her. At the same time, this doesn't indicate the story can mean anything we want it to, since that would be the case of our imagination not bothering with that of the author and just inventing whatever it wants to see in the text. That's not reading, that's writing. But that's another matter, and one we'll discuss elsewhere. On the flip side, if someone in class asks if it's possible that the character under discussion might be a Christ figure, citing 3 or 4 similarities, I'll say something like, works for me. The bottom line I usually tell the class is that Christ figures are where you find them and as you find them. If the indicators are there, then there is some basis for drawing the conclusion. Why, you might ask? Are there Christ figures? As with most other cases we've looked at where the work engages some prior text, the short answer is that probably the writer wants to make a certain point. Perhaps that parallel depends upon our sense of the character's sacrifice, if we see it as somehow similar to the greatness of sacrifice we know of. Maybe it has to do with redemption or hope or miracle. Or maybe it is all being treated ironically to make the character look smaller rather than greater. But count on it, the writer is up to something. How do we know what he's up to? That's another job for our imagination.